Good day, everyone, and welcome to another Live with Kevin, another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Eventually, I'm so glad that you're here with me today, making sure my mic's on. It is. So glad that you're here with me today, with us. I'll introduce our guest in just a second. And if you are with us live, as opposed to seeing this later, just go into the comments on whatever social platform you're on, say hello, tell us where you're located. I would love to know that. My guest would love to know that. It also gets you starting to type, because I would like for you to engage with us throughout this conversation. And here's why. I would like you to imagine that you were joining us for a cup of coffee. And if my guest and I were chatting and you were here and you had a question, you'd ask it, right? If you had a comment, you would share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it. So why not do that here? If you do that, we'll have a better conversation. If you do that, you'll get very likely may get your questions answered, and it will make for a better podcast eventually. So yes, this will eventually be a podcast. You can see it up over my shoulder. If you aren't aware of that, you're just joining us online and didn't know that, this will be eventually a podcast. So now that I've sort of welcomed all of you live, I'm going to do a countdown where we will do a clip of the audio and video for the podcast, which will come out in about a month, the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. In case you haven't noticed, there's a lot changing in our world. As leaders, we must know that, acknowledge that, and lead through it, maybe even in spite of it. But perhaps more than incremental and ongoing change, we must focus on transformation. To transform in the face of disruption requires we take a leap, or several of them. That is our focus today, the leaps we must take to transform our companies, teams, and results. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could be with us in the future live to see these conversations sooner, get the information sooner, and you can do that on any of your favorite social media channels. You can learn about when those are happening, so you can join us by joining either our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Or if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you'll find it there as well. Today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Masterclasses, picked from 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become a more effective, productive, and confident leader while overcoming some of the toughest challenges you might face. You can learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. And now I'm going to bring in our guest. His name is Steve Dennis. And if you're with me on video, you can now see he's there. And let me introduce him while he smiles at you. His name is Steve Dennis. He is a strategic advisor, keynote speaker, podcast host, and the author of Remarkable Retail and his newest book, Leaders Leap: Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption. He has been named a top global retail influencer by several organizations, and his thoughts on the future of shopping are regularly shared in his role as a Forbes senior contributor, as well as through other media, including CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg. He is the president of Sageberry Consulting, where he has advised dozens of brands on their growth strategies. Prior to founding Sageberry, he was the chief strategy officer and SVP of multi-channel marketing at the Neiman Marcus Group. He serves on multiple profit and not-for-profit boards. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA in economics from Tufts. And now he can add being a guest on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. That is probably not going to get added to the bio. But Steve, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks. I'll make sure we update that.
Yeah, just add
as soon as
that
we get off
there,
the mic. Yeah, absolutely.
For the long version, right?
Right.
But listen, I'm so glad that you're here. I love the book. We had the chance to chat for a few minutes before we went live, and I'm glad you're here. So I want to start with a question I often ask. I guess I ask most of the time, because you've done all this work in retail and you've written books, and here you are in your career, and this is probably not at all what you thought you'd do when you were like 10, right? So
Definitely not.
So just give us obviously very high level, but give us kind of a sense, like, how do you end up doing this, and why is this the work of your life now?
Oh, I often say what a long, strange trip it's been because, yeah, you're absolutely right. I did not have this on my bingo card, but the through line, I think, at least for the past 20 or 30 years, is I've always been interested in trying to solve the most interesting problems, I guess, for lack of a better term. And as I got into my career and as I got into retail, I tended to gravitate towards either maybe in a somewhat pathological way, dealing with really thorny turnaround kind of situations, or being on that edge of innovation. What's the next big thing to work on? So that was an early role in e-commerce and then led to a bunch of other things. So that's been the through line, but the way that's played out was really first trying to climb the corporate ladder at several big companies. Then when I got off on my own about 15 years ago as a consultant, I just tried to find different ways to get my ideas out. That led me to writing blogs, going to be a senior contributor at Forbes, starting to do speaking. And then I kind of said, well, if I'm doing this keynote speaking thing, I probably need a book. And so they, in some ways they were the next logical thing to do. At the same time, it was really just finding ways to get my ideas out there and hopefully influence people. So now or at least the last few years, it's really been a shift away from necessarily trying to do the thing that's going to make me the most money or get me the most acclaim to hopefully helping people and companies and organizations achieve their highest potential. So I don't know. It's I was told a long time ago that when you get to the fork in the road, take it. And sometimes that's worked out and other times not so much.
Well, hopefully the fork that led you to today ends up being a good thing for both of us. I know that it will.
Yes.
So one of the things we have in common, I mean, I don't know how much we have in common. I mean, we've both written books and that sort of thing, doing some similar kinds of work. But the other thing we have in common is we both like the word remarkable.
I was going to say,
Remarkable
yes.
for
Yes.
a very long time. Approaching 20 years and starting with Remarkable Leadership, the book. Mm-hmm. And so I found that great as I was reading and getting to know your work as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in why the word leaps. Like, I mean, we're going to talk about the 7 leaps before we're done here, but like there's something to me about that idea of a leap, right? If things are uncertain and we don't know, we're making a leap, but I'm just curious why you picked that and talk about just that idea of leaping, if you would, for a second.
Sure. I didn't, I mean, it's been rattling around in my brain for a little while. It actually ties a little bit to the use of the word remarkable. So I went to college with Seth Godin, that I imagine, and started a business with him when I was 19 or 20. And we've stayed great friends for a long time. And not only did Seth make a big deal about the idea of being remarkable in his book, Purple Cow, right, but he also frequently talks about taking a leap. So I know I had that rattling around in the back of my brain for quite some time. But when I started to work on this book, the thing that I kept coming back to, and it actually doesn't show up in the book in exactly this way, is this question of, if the world has changed so much, why have you changed so little? And by the you, I sometimes mean the leader. In some cases, I mean the business. And as I've worked in retail and I've worked with clients, what I've really seen is the pace of change accelerating. And yet at the same time, many organizations working in a very slow and steady kind of pace, incremental change, faster horse, whatever you want to call it. And, so then I started thinking about, well, there's this leapfrog kind of thing you need to do, that if you're falling further and further behind, you're not going to catch up by incremental change. But even if you take some bold steps, you may end up just innovating to parity, as I describe it in the book. Right. This best practice kind of idea doesn't necessarily work super well when the world is changing so quickly. But the other thing,
that right there, I'm going to stop you right there, Steve.
Sure.
That's an idea that I talk about in the manuscript that I just finished for my next book that comes out next April, is that very point, that that best practices for the world that we live in is not very helpful, because
right.
because we're trying to go and look at something that's set when nothing is set anymore.
Yeah. No, I think Tom Peters has talked. I mean, others have talked about the idea of best practices not being super helpful. So I don't want to
Right.
sound like I necessarily came up with that idea. But the other thing, and it's not specific to like one of the things I end up the book with is talking more about what a leap means. And I think there's both the kind of mindset shift, which is definitely the heart of the book, that
Right.
you have to let go of a way of showing up in the world, a way of leading, a way of operating to be able to get to a fundamentally different place. So there's the letting go aspect, but I think visually like this idea that you're in one place and you have to move to a very different place. And in some cases, maybe most cases, that requires what appears to be a fair amount of risk. That requires you doing things that you haven't done in the past. So it's really much this idea of a visual of
Right.
getting from here to there, kind of crossing the chasm, so to speak, to be, I mean, if you're going to transform, you have to change a lot of things.
100%. So, which takes me to a quote in the book that's not your quote. It's Peter Drucker's quote. So
Mhm.
you've been talking about this a little bit. I'm just going to read this quote and let you sort of say any more along the stream where you just were
Sure.
in relationship to that, because you quote Peter as saying, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence; it's acting with yesterday's logic." And
Right.
that to me is an extension of what you've just been saying about this
Yeah.
idea. And I said it in the open, incremental change isn't going to cut it, right? Anything more
Yeah.
you want to say about that before we go on?
Yeah, well, just one point of clarification, because the subtitle of the book is "Transforming at the Speed of Disruption," and one of the things I found people asking about is, what do I mean by the speed of disruption? And it's kind of like your mileage may vary, right? The speed of disruption is going to be different depending upon your situation. Maybe my dry cleaner down the street is not going through, maybe probably AI is not transforming their business. It's a relatively stable business where incremental improvement is probably perfectly fine. But we all know of lots and lots of industries which have seen seismic shifts, whether they started 5 years ago, or whether they started 25 years ago. So, in a world that is generally speaking changing very, very quickly, whether that's customer needs are changing, competitive dynamics are changing, the most obvious one is technology, then what got you here and again, it could be the leader, it could be the brand. What got you here is not likely to get you where you need to go in the future. And
I
in
mean, you
fact,
opened the book with a story when you were at Sears. Like,
right,
that's all we have to say. We've made that point right there, right?
that's right.
Got
Yeah,
them there for 100+ years, did not allow them to continue, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that, and well, really, not only is it fairly unlikely if you are in a part of the world or an industry that is changing very quickly or is likely to change very quickly going forward, not only is it likely the case that the business model that you've been operating on is going to continue to propel you forward, but also the way you've led is very likely not to get you where you need to get to. But I would say in many cases, and I've seen this not only studying certain companies, but working directly with, on management teams, without naming too many names, but also some clients where it may actually get in the way of you being successful. I talk about Adam Grant's excellent book, Think Again, and he does a much more in-depth analysis of how leadership bias, it could be confirmation bias, it could just be habits, it could be we're pretty comfortable doing the things we've always done because it's gotten results we like. But again, that you need to at least look at whether those things are serving you well.
And we could take that one idea a lot of different directions as well. I know that. I want to get to the leaps though, Steve.
Mhm.
There are 7 of them,
Right.
and we certainly don't have time to unpack them all. In part because you all need to get your own copy of Steve's new book,
There you go.
the
Right.
Leaders Leap.
You sound like
Transforming.
my publicist. Don't give the whole book out, or you got to move some
Yeah,
paper.
they all worry about that. Like, there's no way that's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, and this is not as long as some books that you all might be reading or thinking about, like if you're watching, you can see like this is only it's less than 200, right? We're
Yeah,
200
right
pages.
around 200.
So
Yeah.
that counts the acknowledgments. So it's less than that. We write those acknowledgments, Steve, and then most people don't read them. I always read them because as an author, I'm hoping someone will read mine. So
Or they're looking for
listen,
your name. You're looking for, if you're like me, like you're looking for your name. And
well, most of the time I'm going to assume that's not the case.
I can
It
assure you
occasionally
that
happens.
almost none of the times has that
It's really
ever
quite
happened.
lovely when it does, which
Mhm.
actually is related to the first of the leaps, because the first of the leaps says to crush your ego. What do you mean? What do you mean by crushing your ego?
Sure. So one of the things that is different about this book, I believe, and I hope is useful, is there are tons of really good strategy books, lots of books that tell you about how to innovate better, how to transform, and not just books, podcasts,
Sure.
TED Talks, you name it. What I think is lacking from many of them, and to talk about the acknowledgments, I acknowledge many of those books that have informed my thinking. So it's not as if I think they're not helpful. They can be very, very helpful. But what we know is most transformations fail. And it is generally, at least in my experience and my analysis, not because leaders don't have a sense of what they need to do, nor do they have the tools and resources to help them figure out a better strategy. What often happens is that the leaders get in the way. They know what to do, but they fail to do it. So what I really wanted to understand, and I lean heavily on my own experience, but also studying companies and observing, working with clients, is what gets in the way of doing what you need to do. And so many of the seven leadership mind leaps deal with that. But what I've come to see is that ego is often the enemy. And it's been my experience that when I was not my best, when I didn't do some of the things that would have been demonstrably better to do in my career, but also working and counseling C-suite executives, it's often ego that either gets back to what we were talking about earlier, keeps them from rethinking their approach to a problem. But it's also things like not recognizing that they are not the source, or I am not the source of all wisdom just because I have the corner suite. That I need to be willing to ask for help. And sometimes that's because, one of the things I share in the story is some of my own personal struggles about that. And it didn't help that I was too prideful, I guess, for lack of a better term, to ask for help. But it's also, we have to try to understand the impact of AI. We have to understand robotics. We have to understand all sorts of forces that are evolving or that have become quite different. And so if you're not willing to bring in different voices, people with different expertise, deal with maybe imposter syndrome, where you're afraid to say, I was in that meeting, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. That really gets in the way of your success. So I think ego and breaking through ego, leaning on the words of the great business strategist Taylor Swift of saying, I'm the problem, it's me. I think it's very foundational to being able to move forward and lead in times of turbulence.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And as I said, Steve, there are, as I told everyone, there's 7 leaps here. We're not going to talk about all of them, but I think I have a couple I'd like us to talk about. But
Sure.
let's do this. What's one that maybe for whatever reason you feel like you'd like to talk about today, or maybe it's one that you think is especially important that maybe you don't always get the chance to talk about? Like why don't you just pick one?
Okay.
And let's talk however it is, or whyever it is.
Yeah.
And then I've got a couple others I think we'll chat a little bit about as well.
Well, the one I think is I'm finding that I like to talk about the most, and maybe I don't know that people struggle with it because at one level I think it's obvious. On the other hand, it's maybe the hardest thing to deal with, is this idea that safe is risky, and really exploring how fear often overwhelms what we need to do. And I see this. Like I said, I think the obvious part is, at one level, is that, trying to assess risk, we're wired I'm going to be like a temporary evolutionary biologist here, but we're wired fundamentally to avoid risk. Like, there's very few people, you have your adrenaline junkies and whatnot, but for the most part, most people don't like being uncomfortable, don't like feeling like they might look stupid or foolish. Most people want to progress in their career, get the bonus, et cetera. So there's all sorts of reasons why we're not inclined to take risk personally, as well as for the teams we lead or the organizations
Well,
we
and
lead.
before you go on, let me just say one
Mhm.
thing. And you're talking about, especially back to talking about people in senior leadership. The added piece to that, and it's related to your ego point, is that I got here and this all worked. So
Right.
we're like all of what you said is true, but the further we move in the organization and the more success we've had, however we want to
Mhm.
define that, it's adding more layers to what you're saying.
Yeah, there's more at stake. The more you're moving out of your comfort zone, generally speaking, and the more successful you've been, the more is at stake. And I can tell you, I work, as just a quick example, I worked with the CEO of a very large corporation who got a lot of accolades for having not turned the company around, but taken the brand to a whole new level. Uh, but at the same time, what I think was becoming more and more obvious, um, but somewhat controversial, was that some of the things that had worked so well for about a decade were not only starting to not work particularly well, they were starting to really kind of show chinks in the armor of the strategy. And so when I was trying to persuade him, not just me, but team, trying to persuade him to explore some different avenues, he basically said to me, "You're telling me my baby is ugly." First of all, so to challenge a strategy that had gotten him a lot of accolades and been demonstrably successful, was hard for him to get his head around. But the other thing was, doing something different would potentially risk his legacy, and he was not too far from retirement. So it's not trivial to get people to take on a much more riskier way of being. But I think the other thing is, we're just bad at assessing risk. Like, it's so much easier. I use the example in the book that, we all know that not getting enough exercise and eating a terrible diet may lead to bad health outcomes. But generally speaking, those health outcomes are very far out, right? So the day we
They're
sit
less
down,
far out now, Steve.
well, I was going to say, right.
For me
Yes.
anyway, right?
Yes. As we move one day closer to death, every day, it starts to be more challenging. But, in a given moment, or week to week, month to month, for example, I use the department store industry, which is one of my favorite things to pick on, partially because of my experience, but partially because I think a lot of people, even if you're not in retail, can relate to it. The major department stores in the US, Macy's, JCPenney, et cetera, obviously Sears, they have been losing market share at a pretty good clip for more than 20 years. And so it's not hard to project out where that's going to lead. And so it's not surprising that a lot of stores have closed, not surprising. But this has been going on, as I said, for 20 years, yet none of them have done anything of any significance to stem the tide. So to not do it turns out to be the incredible, very, very risky. So we've seen Sears go away. We've seen JCPenney almost go away. We've seen plenty of brands that didn't get put in harm's way overnight. It's actually taken quite a long time, and yet they haven't taken action. So I think,
and even the casual observer can see it, right?
Right.
It doesn't take an analyst to figure it out.
Well, again, so that's what I'm saying. Part of this book is not so much the strategy points. Like, I don't know that blue ocean strategy is going to help with the issue of taking action on things that may risk extinction, exactly right? So I think we have to, and again, depending upon where you are on the spectrum of challenge from disruption, might be somewhat different. But I think we have to re-examine our relationship with risk and see that the status quo, or even slow and steady change, can be phenomenally risky, that it's not actually that risky in the scheme of what most of us are dealing with, to do that AI partnership or to do some tests. And one of the other things I try to point out, and I get into a little bit more in one of the later chapters, is trying to figure out how to go fast but not recklessly is another important thing. So, it's one thing to embrace that slow and steady is very risky. It's another thing then to navigate your way and say, okay, that's fine. I'm not just going to then put all money on, one number in Vegas. I've got to figure out a way to sensibly manage risk. But if you can't fundamentally embrace that you're likely to risk irrelevance, if not extinction, by not changing your relationship to risk, I think there's lots of examples we can look at in the rearview mirror where that's very, very clearly true. And I think the real call to action here is to say, well, it's not getting any better. The pace of change is speeding up. There's fewer places to hide. So if you can't see that safe is actually the riskiest thing you can do, you're probably going to find yourself in a lot of trouble if you're not there already.
So you hinted at it, but another one of the leaps is you title it "Faster, Faster, Go, Go, Go,"
Right.
and even in reading that, it's like, and yet you just hinted at this idea of faster, and the word speed is in the subtitle of the book, and yet we've got to figure out how to be intelligent about that. So can you talk about that tension there just a little bit?
Yeah, so even just stepping back a little bit, one of the things I set up in the beginning of the book is that if you think, and there are more dimensions to this for sure, but there's kind of two fundamental dimensions I try to play with in the book. One is, and actually gets back to the helpful word in the title of your podcast and the title of my first book, this idea of being remarkable, which is in a world that has become where the power has flipped from brands or organizations to customers, where we have almost infinite choice, 24/7 access, the friction between buyer and seller has been eroded. The need to be truly remarkable has never been more powerful. And in this case, what I mean by remarkable is highly differentiated, leaps and bounds above the competition, ideally. So there's one dimension of the customer value you need to deliver being really powerful, differentiated, and creating that gap between the competition. But the other dimension is speed. So when things are changing faster and faster, even if you can deliver remarkable value, if you do it too slowly, you may find yourself in trouble. So part of what I try to get into is, how do you first understand the speed of disruption? How fast do you need to move? But how can you actually build speed, agility, and other concepts into your business model? Because I think, for many businesses, certainly in retail where I've spent most of my time, when we were in a world where physical assets were dominant, then it was just really hard to move that quickly. If you look at Starbucks or Home Depot or whatever, it took them a long time to build out a national chain. Now we have brands like Shein, Amazon is perhaps a more familiar example, that because they are an e-commerce model, they are not as reliant on physical assets. And so they can actually grow quite quickly in a way that wasn't so much the case in the past. So speed's become a more defining factor. Agility has become a more defining factor. And so the question is, how can you build the speed and agility into your system? Now, some of that is recognizing and reconfiguring your business model to be more adaptive. But some of it is really building this culture of experimentation, of testing and learning, and a portfolio approach. So you don't want to get to the situation where you're so desperate that you have to do kind of the moonshot or the Hail Mary kind of approach.
Right.
But how do you iterate, fail faster? Some of these concepts have been around for a little while. I certainly didn't come up with them. But I think you have to really fundamentally ask yourself, how can I accelerate the pace of change? How can I innovate at the speed of disruption, if not maybe even a little bit ahead? And some companies are terrific at that, but when I look at the companies that have struggled, most of them have more. I sometimes go into organizations when I'm consulting with them, or if I'm doing a speaking gig, and I'll say, just tell me how things work around here. Would you say that you're more wired to say yes as an organization, or you're more wired to say no? And almost everybody can answer that question. And they know that the answer is not wired. Like, you shouldn't say we're wired to say no. It just happens to be the uncomfortable reality, because the defenders of the status quo and the slow and steady mindset
Right.
is the prevailing culture. And I think that's very dangerous.
So, Steve, we've been talking about the leaps. We've only talked about 3 or 4 of the 7. I'm just going to read them off so everyone has
Sure.
them, and then I'm going to ask you a different kind of question. So,
Okay.
so everybody, the 7 leaps are: crush your ego, wake up, special, not big, start with wow, think radically, and then we've talked about safe is risky, and faster, faster, go, go, go. Here's my question. And you and I talked before we went live, before we hit the button, about how this isn't really a book about retail, that and which I agree with 100%. But I don't even think has to only be a book, even though this conversation has sort of been the very big picture, sort of organizational questions. When you read those 7 leaps, even if you haven't read the book yet, everybody, my observation is that there isn't just organizational leaping. There isn't even just leaping within the organization. There's personal leaping. And yes, you mentioned this as a mindset book, which it is, but talk about the idea, my language now, about about taking these leaps personally and not just even organizationally. You want to talk about that for a second before
Sure.
we wrap up?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. So one thing, which is a little bit of a backdrop, and I kind of allude to it, but I don't really talk much about this in the book, is when I was writing this, I was really trying to push myself, and my publisher and editor were pushing me to take more personal leaps in the way I was writing it. And you mentioned that it's not a very long book. Some of that is because I wanted to be less prescriptive and more inspirational. And I think that can be more effective in storytelling, as opposed to more the way I wrote Remarkable Retail. And, I was also, just as an aside, and I love some of these books, so I don't mean any disrespect, but when I went back and read Good to Great and Blue Ocean Strategy and some of these books, I'm like, oh my God, they're so long and they're so dense and there's so many examples. And I wonder whether that is really the thing that causes people to make the changes. So I wanted to write it in a more sort of breezy storytelling way. But yeah, several people have said to me that a lot of the advice in the book really can apply to personal situations, relationships. I get asked the question, well, is this a book just for the C-suite? And I would say my orientation in writing it is more for those who can drive strategy. And I'm sure some people lower in the organization may go, well, I have some ideas on that, but I can't affect that. But I do think most of these leaps, our ego gets in the way in one-to-one relationships, on teams, et cetera. The idea of waking up has a lot more to do with kind of exploring the perimeters of your ignorance. What are those things that you believe to be true that maybe aren't? What are things you need to learn? That applies in lots and lots of situations. I would say special, not big is maybe a little bit more of a strategy point. Start with wow. I think we can, have wow in our business model, but we can also have wow in what we deliver working on a project, right? And thinking more expansively, thinking radically about solution rather than just incremental change applies a lot. And I think we're all dealing with a world that is moving ever faster. And so if I'm a designer, a graphic designer, what do I need to do to be more responsive and learn more quickly and maybe put more experiments out into the world, as opposed to having a more fixed mindset? So yeah, I think pretty much all of them have applicability to our roles as a project manager, our roles at being in romantic relationships, frankly, in some cases.
So we're talking with Steve Dennis, the author of Leaders Leap, and we're making, he's expanding on my observation is that there's more to this. It's not a book about retail, although there are a lot of retail examples. It's not a book for senior leaders necessarily only, although there's a lot in this specifically written for them. But I do think for all of you who are listening, you will find great value in this book, which is why I asked Steve to join us. Steve, before we finish, a couple of other things, kind of shifting gears before we wrap up. My next question is, well, actually, my last 3 questions are all questions I ask everybody. Here we go. Here's the first one. What do you do for fun, Steve?
not enough lately. I guess editing my book and producing my podcast is probably not the most fun thing. I love to travel. I love to eat, and so a lot of what I do is really getting out and experiencing different cultures. I find it both fun and mind expanding. I guess I think to the degree I see myself as a creative person, I find that exploring art and music and different cultures is really probably my main thing. I need to get back to. Apparently, I need to play pickleball. That's my main thing, but I haven't taken that
There
on
you
yet.
go. That's starting to show. If we take the arc of this show since 2016, no one talked about pickleball, but now it shows up about every few weeks. Pickleball seems to show up. It showed up just recently. I think it was last week, actually. So here's the other question. The only one I told you I was going to ask you. What are you reading these days?
I'm actually going back and rereading a few things, partially because I realize my memory is hazy on some of these things, and it comes up. I'm going back and reading some of Stephen Pressfield's work. I'm not sure how many people would know Stephen Pressfield. He's a very successful screenwriter and novelist, but he's also written a few really great books, I guess you could say, on kind of personal self-transformation. The War of Art is the one that kind of really brought him to fruition, where he talks about this concept of resistance. And it's really about overcoming fear. It's more specifically in the context of staring at that blank page when you're trying to write something. But it's also just kind of like your question earlier. It's kind of a sneaky book. I don't know if I know Stephen a little bit, but I don't know if he meant it this way originally. Because you read it and you go, well, this isn't just for writers or artists. This is really for anybody that's having a hard time getting out of their head and taking those first steps to putting something out in the world. So I'm going back on that. I mentioned Adam Grant's Think Again, which I read when it first came out. And like I said, I do reference that in the book, but there's so many just great nuggets there. And as I'm getting asked questions about this book, I'm finding like I want to go back to some of these people and be able to go that next level of detail when I can ask questions.
Love that. And we'll have, as always, we'll have links to all of those, including Steve's book in the show notes here. So you can find those there. But before we go, where do you want to point people? Where can people learn more about you, connect with you, get the book, anything you want to tell us before we wrap up?
Sure. Well, they should be able to find the book, the hardcover, the ebook, the Audible version pretty easily on any of the websites where you love to enjoy your books. My website has information about my advisory work and that kind of stuff, which is Stephen P. Dennis, Stephen with a V, the proper way to spell Stephen, I would say. And I'm quite active on social media. I would say at this point, LinkedIn is probably the place where I'm most active, but also a little bit on X and Instagram and even Threads. So
there you go. Stephen
go out there and find me.
Dennis.com, everybody. So before we go, everyone, I have a question I ask all of you who I know you can't respond, but it's an important question. And so the question that I ask all of you who are watching or listening, whether it's now or later, is now what? What action are you going to take as now that you've consumed this conversation between Steve and I? And hopefully we would both hope that you would buy a copy of the book, but that's not the only thing I'm asking here. I'm saying, what nuggets did you take from this that you found interesting that you're going to translate into action for you? Maybe something that Steve said about safe is risky resonated with you, and there's some action that you need to take. Maybe it was something, it doesn't matter what it was during our conversation, right? Which mindset shift occurred for you that you need to think more about, you need to take some action on. It's those things that will make this more than just an enjoyable use of your time, but turn it into something valuable for you, not just entertaining, but useful into the future. So I hope that you will answer that question. I hope that you will do more than just enjoy our time, but take action on what you learned. Steve, thanks for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad that we had the chance to chat about it.
Likewise. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And everybody, you know that you've been watching and listening to an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So if you just stumbled upon it, you want to stumble back, which means subscribe wherever it is that you do get your podcasts. And if you liked it, tell someone else. They'll like it as well. Everybody wins if you do that. And we'll be back next week, because every single week we're here with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.